Good evening and welcome to UCI. I am especially grateful that you've made UCI a part of your evening today. I want to talk briefly about why this event matters, because UCI is a public research university and serves as the public square for Orange County, where more than 3 million people from a broad cross-section of society live and work. This role animates this evening's presentation of the UCI Confronting Extremism program. Our goal is not to change anyone's mind, but rather to provide perspective and insight into some of society's most pressing challenges and issues. This includes the extent of the relationship of anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism. Of course, one program alone cannot exhaust this evening's topic, nor for that matter, extremism in the wider world. Nonetheless, in this highly polarized age, it is all the more imperative that public research universities like UCI serve as a venue to convene our diverse community to promote understanding. So, whether you are curious about this subject matter, or have confirmed opinions, or are simply skeptical, I want to welcome you to be in this community this evening for an evening of stimulating conversation and debate. And to launch our program this evening, I want to introduce Chancellor Howard Gilman, who will present our special guest. Howard Gilman became the 6th Chancellor of the University of California, Irvine in September 2014. Under Chancellor Gilman's leadership, UCI has been consistently ranked in the top 10 of all public universities in the nation by the U.S. News and World Report, received national acclaim as the university, quote, doing the most for the American dream, unquote, and expanded its capacity to improve lives in our region and around the world. Chancellor Gilman grew up in North Hollywood and was a first-generation college student, earning bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in political science at UCLA. An award-winning scholar and teacher of the American Constitution in the Supreme Court, his most recent book, co-authored with Erwin Chemerinsky, is entitled Free Speech on Campus. Please join me in welcoming the 6th Chancellor of UCI, Howard Gilman.
Thank you, Doug. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much for being here. And actually, before I get started, I want to thank Doug for his campus leadership on addressing issues that are central to the Jewish community, and especially for developing systematic campus programming that highlight vital questions relating to anti-Semitism. He ensured that we were the only UC campus that in the wake of the Regent's statements on anti-Semitism, wrote a comprehensive report entitled Higher Ground, identifying issues and responding with comprehensive plans involving 19 important recommendations, which earned high praise from organizations around the country and from me. Doug, thank you for all of your great service to the university. I do think he deserves a round of applause. And he's going to be a great moderator tonight. In August 2017, the nation was shocked to see a large mob of neo-Nazis march through Charlottesville, Virginia, shouting anti-Jewish slogans, including that unforgettable chant, "Jews will not replace us." It was one of the largest hate-gathering events in America in recent history, but it was unique only in size, not in content, for we have seen increasing displays of hate, violence, and unrest as extremists have been increasingly emboldened. I have had to do too many campus messages these last few years in response to attacks and threats against Jews and Jewish institutions, our own Mirage JCC, Pittsburgh, San Diego. You are all too aware of the record. It was in response to Charlottesville that UCI established our Confronting Extremism initiative. The initiative is designed to understand ideas and behaviors far outside our values and identifying pathways for building more positive campus and democratic communities here and abroad. Most relevant for this evening, it recognizes the national and international dimensions of white nationalism, including the rise of anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence, and treats these questions as vitally important matters for research and teaching and debate and discussion. Confronting extremism is premised on the assumption that hate is like mold. It thrives in dark corners of society and cyberspace. Its enemies are bright light and fresh air. Tonight, UCI Confronting Extremism presents in conversation two of the most compelling voices in American commentary, and as it happens, they are colleagues at the New York Times. And it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce them to you. Michelle Goldberg became an op-ed columnist for the New York Times in 2017 and was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for public service for reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues. She is the author of 3 books: Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, The Means of Production, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, and The Goddess Pose, The Audacious Life of Indra Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West. Her first book was a finalist for the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism, and her second won the Ernesta Drinker Ballad Book Prize and the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. Previously, she was a columnist at Slate, a frequent commentator on radio and television. Ms. Goldberg's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Newsweek, The Nation, The New Republic, The Guardian, and many other publications, and she has reported from many countries, including India, Iraq, Egypt, Uganda, Nicaragua, Argentina, and earlier this month, Ukraine, which might be a little topic in the news these days. Bret Stephens also joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 2017 after a long career at the Wall Street Journal, where he was most recently deputy editorial page editor and for 11 years a foreign affairs columnist. Before that, he was editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, where he oversaw the paper's news, editorial, and digital operations and its international editions, and also wrote a weekly column. He has reported from around the world and interviewed scores of world leaders. Mr. Stephens is the author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, which unfortunately had such a short shelf life given contemporary issues. Just kidding. He is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions, including 2 honorary doctorates and the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Commentary. Last spring, he received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor with his family and his mother, who had entered this country through Ellis Island, at his side. He was raised in Mexico City and holds a BA from the University of Chicago and an MCS from the London School of Economics. Dear friends, from sea to shining sea, these are incredible people and spokespersons from the right coast who have decided to come to the left coast to have a fantastic and enlightening conversation with us all. Will you please welcome Michelle Goldberg and Bret Stephens in a discussion of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, moderated by...
Thank you so much for joining us, Bret and Michelle. And so I want to sort of set the context, as well as to lay out the format today. As the Chancellor mentioned, both Michelle Goldberg and Bret Stephens are highly accomplished prize-winning journalists whose commentary on a host of topics shapes the contours of our nation's political discourse. This is particularly the case in reference to the question of the relationship of anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism. They both have written with clarity and purpose on this topic in their respective columns and participated in the New York Times podcast series entitled The Argument. As a moderator, I want to outline the format. The speakers have both agreed graciously to a conversational debate And I'm sure you're wondering, what does that mean? We'll open, when we get there, to alternating statements about the issues at stake in exploring the relationship of anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism. From here, the speakers may engage with each other regarding their respective positions. I will raise questions to move the debate along, as well as share your questions that you provided during your online registration, and those of you who supplied comment cards with questions. So that's the format. But I want to go back to something that Chancellor Gilman referred to, and that is the context for this debate today, particularly within the University of California and UCI. Because in 2019, as the Chancellor noted, the UC Regents adopted the final report of the Regents Working Group on Principles Against Intolerance. And this is a consequential report grounded in free speech that really summarized existing state and federal policies that prohibit discrimination. And the report was quite clear about the damage of discrimination. It prohibited discrimination, quote, arising from historical biases, stereotypes, and prejudice, jeopardized the research, teaching, and service mission of the university, close quote. In turn, university leaders were called to challenge anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination when and wherever they emerge within the university community. And I want to sort of zero in on the report as it relates to anti-Semitism, because the report acknowledged, quote, the historic manifestations of anti-Semitism that have changed, and that expressions of anti-Semitism are often coded and difficult to identify. In particular, opposition to Zionism often is expressed in ways that are not simply assertions of disagreements over policies and politics, but also assertions of prejudice and intolerance towards Jewish people and culture, unquote. Even as the working group accepted the existence of anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism, it could not agree on how to respond to them without infringing on free speech and academic freedom. This is reflected in the report that the regions adopted. The principles are more than aspirational, but their violation is not an independent basis for discipline. If anything, the principles underscore the multifaceted nature of the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. In different contexts, it can be an issue of religion, of politics, of philosophy, of theology, of history. It is almost never a simple issue of the law. In other words, we as a society in Irvine, Orange County, California, the nation, are simultaneously wrestling with this relationship while honoring and defending free speech and academic freedom. It is imperfect, and it can be messy. It is why this evening's program is so important today. So, let's get to it. I invited the speakers to outline the issues at stake in reference to the relationship of anti-Semitism to anti-Zionism. And Michelle Goldberg would set us off.
Okay. So, hi, thank you for having me. Before I start, I should point out that I'm not making an argument for anti-Zionism. I mean, personally, I still think that the only livable solution to the conflict in the Middle East is a two-state solution, as increasingly out of reach as that is. So I'm not saying that anti-Zionism is the correct position. I'm saying that I think it's a legitimate position. And there's two reasons why I think it's important to, and I can kind of lay that out at greater length
Sure.
as we go on. I mean, I would say quickly that there's obviously a long history of Jewish anti-Zionism going up to the creation of Israel that mostly disappeared for most of Israel's existence and has now reemerged among the young Jewish left, in magazines like Jewish Currents, in some kind of nascent Jewish organizations that are very active in protesting white supremacy and white nationalism. And I think there's a couple of different reasons for that. But before I say that, I would say that there are two reasons I think it's really important to distinguish these two phenomenon. The first is because of how often conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism ends up infringing on free speech about the conflict in the Middle East. There's a lot of talk about the climate for free speech on campus. There's a lot of talk about, kind of left-wing students being intolerant and shutting down debate, and I agree that that happens. But the only government threats to free speech on campus that are happening right now, where you have states and in some cases the federal government trying to pass laws foreclosing people's rights to engage in certain kinds of political activity, particularly the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, is around this issue. So one of the greatest threats to free speech on campus and free speech generally, in my opinion, comes from conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I also think my position on this has changed as the facts on the ground in Israel and Palestine have changed. So as long as I've been kind of aware of this issue, people have been saying that the time for a two-state solution is running out, that eventually facts on the ground are going to make the two-state solution impossible. Tzipi Livni, the former foreign minister of Israel, also had a bunch of other roles. I think she said to me that, we only have a couple years for this the first time I met her, which was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And so I think that I don't see how you can say, given how many respectable voices out there are saying that, have been saying for, decades, that the time for a two-state solution is running out. We only have a couple of years left. You cannot then, I think, stigmatize people who say it's run out. The anti-Zionist position today is usually people calling for a binational state. I don't think there's any legitimacy for people who would say, as the old kind of Palestinian radicals, would talk about driving the Jews into the sea. But the people who I'm talking about, the people who I think deserve at least to be heard, are the people who say there functionally is one state between the river and the sea, right? And so when Palestinians, as I think some of the younger generation of Palestinians have turned from demanding their own Palestinian state and have said, it's never going to happen. And it's not us that's saying it's never going to happen. It's the Israeli government that's saying it's never going to happen. It's Bibi Netanyahu saying it's never going to happen, saying that he's going to annex a big part of the West Bank and maybe more of the West Bank later. So if you're only going to have one state, then the question turns to what kind of state is it going to be? And I don't see how you can argue that it is illegitimate for Palestinians or people who care about equal rights to say that it is anti-Semitic for people to demand equal rights in the state in which they are actually living, just because that would threaten Jewish sovereignty. I've had Palestinians say to me, you wouldn't accept in your country people saying, you wouldn't accept people saying that this is a Christian nation. You wouldn't accept people saying that your rights have to be somehow limited lest you change the demography of your country. And in fact, the people who are kind of constantly talking about the danger of immigrants changing the demography of this country are the people who marched on Charlottesville, and we consider that illegitimate. The last thing I would say is that, and the reason that I think that this is dangerous right now, or that there needs to be a separation between these two concepts right now, is because we're in this weird position where there is this resurgence of really dangerous, murderous, right-wing anti-Semitism in this country, of right-wing white nationalism. And the discourse that we have about the real danger being from these college students or from BDS or from kind of left-wing anti-Zionist activism, I think really distracts from that. I know when I talk to some of the younger Jewish left-wing activists, they are furious at the established Jewish communities that seem more concerned about BDS than about armed white nationalists, and frankly, about the president that encourages them. And so we now have this strange situation where, because they are pro-Israel, people who are close to some of these white nationalists, not only do they sort of get a pass, because we've essentially associated support for Israel with support for the Jewish people writ large. Not only do they get a pass, but we have a very bizarre situation that's emerged recently of right-wing Gentiles accusing left-wing Jews of anti-Semitism because of the left-wing Jews' opinions about Israel. And I'll give you one example before I shut up. So some of you guys know who some of you guys know who Seb Gorka is, right? Does everyone know who that is? You know, he's a person who belongs to, he's a lifetime member of a Hungarian fascist group called I'm going to pronounce it wrong, the Vitezi Rand, I think, is that right?
Close enough.
You know, which was aligned with the Nazis during World War II. And he has the audacity to call, you know, a young Jewish activist named Max Berger an anti-Semite and try to start a kind of campaign to get him fired from the Elizabeth Warren campaign because he had led an anti-occupation Jewish group. And a friend of mine was a friend of mine with a kind of, you know, liberal Zionist mother, you know, someone who, you know, loves Israel, hates Trump, was saying to me that she's very skeptical about Elizabeth Warren, which might think that's okay, but she's very skeptical of Elizabeth Warren because she heard Elizabeth Warren is anti-Semitic, and she heard it because of this story. And so I think that this allows for a lot of disinformation.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot.
Sorry, that was supposed to be 2 minutes.
Brett?
Well, first of all, let me just say how honored I am to be here, and in particular, how honored I am to share the stage with Michelle. I guess I'll make just a few points. First of all, why are we here? We're here because it's impossible to escape the conclusion that anti-Semitism, which is a hatred that maybe 20 years ago we thought we could put to rest in America and maybe even in the world at large, is resurging in a big way. And it's resurging through various vectors. Some of the most obvious vectors, which we saw in Poway and of course in Pittsburgh, come from the far right. Some of them come in a slightly more disguised form in attacks on, say, globalists or elites that have a resonance in old-fashioned attacks on Jews. But there's another vector which is important and which really can't be ignored, which is anti-Semitism coming by way of anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism serving, if you will, as a cover for a set of ideas, beliefs, and prejudices about Jews that are very long-standing. So the first thing I want to say is talk a little bit about the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They are distinct phenomena, but they are related phenomena. And if you think of a Venn diagram, the only, I think, serious question when talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is the extent to which the two circles overlap. And I suspect Michelle and I would agree that they do overlap. The question is the extent to how far they overlap. My contention is as follows. First of all, anti-Zionism is a hatred which on its own is as pernicious as anti-Semitism. And secondly, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism overlap in a much broader way than some people might suspect. Now, first of all, about anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel, okay? Elizabeth Warren wants to cut off aid, or might consider cutting off aid, military aid to Israel if it doesn't change its policies on settlements. That is not an anti-Semitic position, and it's not an anti-Zionist position either. It's a perfectly consistent, although I don't agree with it at all, it's perfectly consistent with at least a left-wing Zionist position. There are many ways in which one can fairly and strongly criticize Israeli policy and not be an anti-Zionist. But anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel or criticism of Israeli policy. Anti-Zionism is the view that Israel as a Jewish state, and Israel is a Jewish state, otherwise it would not be called Israel, should not exist. Now, this is unique. I can think of no other country whose very existence is questioned as in a broad ideological manner in the same way. Denmark is a country that is based on a Christian foundation. If you're a Dane, you actually pay tax to the Danish Lutheran Church. There are explicit requirements of Danishness which go into being a Dane. And yet, as far as I'm aware, there is no movement that says Denmark should not exist as it does, okay? Most of the world consists not of states based on the American model of a pluribus unum. They consist on states based on the nation-state model, whether it's Japan or Iceland or Denmark or one thing or another. And these contain various cultural facets which are, broadly speaking, compatible with liberal democratic ideals, but they're not perfectly compatible with liberal democratic ideals. But anti-Zionism, remarkably, seems to be the only ideological movement which calls for the destruction of a sovereign UN member state. Now think about that. Let's imagine that you're an Israeli citizen who perhaps you're an Arab citizen or Druze, or you're not religious, Judaism isn't a part of your life, and yet there are people around the world who, because you are Israeli, will boycott you if you're an academic or an athlete or a businessman. Now that strikes me, even if you were to completely remove the question of Judaism and anti-Semitism, as an extraordinarily invidious and hateful movement. Anyone who has visited Israel knows it's an imperfect country, but also knows it's a dynamic country with incredible people that is trying to do its best. So anti-Zionism alone, if it were divorced from anti-Semitism entirely, I think would be an ideology that we would question just as strongly as we would question if there suddenly were a movement here at UCI that said, you know, France shouldn't exist. Crappy country, terrible food, right? Now then, let's talk about anti-Semitism and the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. First of all, in an age in which we are so aware of the hidden ways in which prejudice operates, or the disguised ways in which prejudice operates, it should raise an eyebrow that the one country that is subject to this form of this view, this sort of opposition, happens to be the Jewish country. There are other ways in which anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism overlap. Let me give you an example. Israel, so say anti-Zionists, is committing genocide in Gaza. Now, this is an amazing claim, if anyone knows the meaning of the word genocide, because these same people will also note that the population of Gaza is growing at an extraordinarily high rate. So Israel must be committing the most incompetent genocide in all of history if it is indeed committing genocide in Gaza. The reason the genocide claim is made is because it replicates an ancient blood libel, which is that Jews revel in the blood of their religious adversaries. Right. Just I'll take 30 more seconds, or a few more seconds, okay? If one looks at other anti-Zionist tropes, they have an amazing correspondence with old-fashioned anti-Semitic language. It is incumbent on us, when we are aware of all the dog whistles that happen when it comes to race or when it comes to gender, to be equally aware of the dog whistles when it comes to Jews. None of us can sit still for any form of prejudice. Doesn't mean we should ban it. I'm not talking about free speech, but it means we should be aware of it and understand just how disreputable it is.
Michelle, where do you agree and disagree?
Well, I guess the place I think Bret is right that both of us agree that there's overlap in the Venn diagram and essentially disagree about how big it is, right? So I'm not going to defend the libel about Israelis committing genocide in Gaza. There's a lot of things that you've mentioned that some anti-Zionists have said that I'm not going to defend. The thing that I guess my biggest objection or my fundamental objection is this idea that anti-Zionism is on its own. I don't remember exactly what you said, an invidious hatred. And the reason is because people will often say this, why only Israel, right? You would never ask whether France has a right to exist or Canada has a right to exist. Well, actually, I think that if half of the people in the territory of France did not have full national rights and were asking for them, you might say that they should be granted them even at the expense of the French national character. And so to me, that is the question, and it's a question that has been forced by the creation of a one-state reality, right? And also, and I should say that there are certainly groups of people in this world who are regularly denied their national aspirations because it's not territorially possible, or because people think it's not territorially possible, including the Palestinians, right? If it is de facto bigoted to deny the national aspirations of a group of people, then both sides of this debate are implicated. But again, I would say that I would ask Bret, and I think I've asked you this before, given that the two-state solution really is slipping out of our reach, as much as I think that any other kind of solution to this crisis would be disastrous. When Palestinians, I'm sure you've had Palestinians say this to you as they've said it to me, why shouldn't we have equal rights in this land in which we live? What is your answer to them?
Well, okay. We're having a conversation. Your comments remind me of a wonderful line about my alma mater. Two University of Chicago graduates are speaking. They say, okay, I understand how it works in practice, but tell me how it works in theory. And you've laid out something that I think is theoretical. Let me just talk about a few points of practice. First of all, just very briefly, Morocco has been occupying Western Sahara for decades. There is no movement in the world, and Morocco is one of our oldest allies here in the United States. There's no American movement to free Western Sahara. India, one of our largest trading partners and closest allies, has just essentially seized Kashmir. I am not aware of any movement on campuses, mass movements on campuses for free Kashmir. So I just want to sort of highlight the strangeness that we're talking about this one occupation and imagining that none other exists, either among American foes or American allies. Secondly, Israel has been, second point, Israel did not choose an occupation. An occupation was forced on Israel in 1967 because its enemies decided they were going to wage a war of annihilation against the Jewish state. That is a simple historical fact. The Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 1964 when Israel occupied not 1 millimeter of the West Bank and not 1 millimeter of Gaza. And we have to take historical reality into account and not simply speak in matters of theory. Secondly, after 1993, Israel sought in a concerted way to get out of the occupation business. It agreed to peace with the PLO, with Yasser Arafat, who was considered a blood enemy. It withdrew from most Palestinian population centers. In 2005, it withdrew every settler and every settlement from the Gaza Strip. So the argument that Israel has simply made no effort whatsoever to get out of the occupation business is just not a historical reality. Now, it is also true that Israel has been building settlements in the West Bank, in part because, as Israel understands it, the 1949 line that created the West Bank and created the Gaza Strip was an armistice line. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but these historical facts matter. Now, I and Michelle agree that a two-state solution is the best and, in my view, the only ultimate solution, because Israelis in the long term don't want to govern in any respect the lives of Palestinians. And by the way, largely they don't govern the lives of Palestinians. And obviously, Palestinians don't want to be governed by Israel. But the modalities here really matter. In 2005, Israel withdrew every settlement and every settler from Gaza. It withdrew from Gaza's border with Egypt. The idea that Gaza is wholly surrounded by Israel is just geographically illiterate. And the result was for Israelis that they did not get more peace, they got less peace. The result for Palestinians is they did not get better governance, they got theocratic governance in the form of Hamas. Now, these are the messy historical realities that Israel is forced to deal with. But the idea, this is the last point I want to make, I have been covering Israel-Palestine for 20 years. And every time I'm out there, someone says, we've only got 1 year to solve this or else it's all over, all right? And somehow it's like the bulletin of atomic scientists. It's always 2 minutes to midnight, and it has been since 1947, right? Eventually, I'm confident that Israelis and Palestinians under different leadership, and Israel, I hope, will be getting a different leader relatively soon, and hopefully the Palestinians will be getting a different leader relatively soon, are going to find a way at achieving an honorable two-state settlement. But until that time, the suggestion that that a reasonable answer is to call for the elimination of Israel as a Jewish state, I think is wrong, and I think it's also an invitation to not just anti-Zionism, but to anti-Semitism itself.
So you sort of agree that many critics are calling for the elimination?
Well, I guess I think that we have to talk about what we mean when we say calling for the elimination of Israel, right? I mean, there's kind of true eliminationism, right? Driving the Jews out of Israel, as, I think Palestinian militants have wanted to do for a long time, as, Arab armies wanted to do. When I talk about anti-Zionism, the sort of anti-Zionism that we're talking about in these debates on college campuses and the BDS movement, it's essentially saying, is Israel eliminated? Is Israel eliminated if it's no longer, if it basically becomes a state for all its citizens, right? Or if if it gives citizenship to all the people who live within its territory, and so can Israel kind of continue to exist without a Jewish majority or without, kind of a Jewish character? So when people talk about that's kind of the stakes. And I agree, and you've said this to me before, right? About I agree with you. What is it? That sounds like what is the line from the University of Chicago line?
I agree. I understand how it works in practice.
Theory.
Tell me how it works in theory.
Right. So, and this is why I've said that I think that a two-state solution is far superior. But again, when I talk, but the reason that I would defend the decency of some of my friends who make the contrary argument is because the two-state solution seems so far over the horizon. The facts on the ground are changing every single day. And you have not just kind of Netanyahu saying that he was going to annex the Jordan Valley, but Benny Gantz wants to do it too, right? And so there is no, you're right, Israel doesn't want Gaza, but Israel has never wanted Gaza.
That's not true.
You think Israel kind of wanted?
It was a traumatic withdrawal.
It was much smaller than.
Well, population-wise, Gaza and the West Bank are actually equivalent. The territory is different.
But right. But so you think?
But can I ask you a question
Sure.
just quickly? So let's imagine in a future binational state, 51% of the population, 50.1% of the population is non-Jewish. And they decide that they want to rename their state. Israel ceases to exist. Israel, the idea, look, the name Israel, okay, it's not just, Israel is not America. And I think this is a thing that Americans have a really hard time getting their head around, okay?
I think
Because-
most
So
of
what
the
I,
people
oh wait,
here
but
are
what I'm saying is that I think that the facts on the ground of the occupation, and whenever I talk to, kind of people who are defenders of the Israeli government, both here and in Israel, there's this idea, well, Israel's never wanted to do this. It was forced to do this by circumstances. And I think that that is true to some extent, but there's also, a lot of people in Israel who dream of a greater Israel, who aspire to a greater Israel, for whom this is not, something that they are doing, reluctantly and tragically, and if only they could retreat to the 67 borders, right? You know that there's a lot of people who want all of that land and who see that as the entire country. And so, again, I think that these facts on the ground, which are being created by Israel, they force a question, which is the continued existence of Israel as a Jewish state more important than giving equal rights and representation to all of the people who exist in that territory? I understand why Jews think it's more important for Israel to continue as a Jewish state, but why would other people think that? Why would Palestinians think it's more important? Why should other people privilege? There's obviously, a kind of record of historical trauma and a reason that Israel was created at the expense of some of the native Palestinian inhabitants, right? And I would say that as much as they were dispossessed, as much as it was a tragedy for them, it was a necessary tragedy. It was worth it. What I've never understood is why we expect them to think it was worth it. And again, when they come to the world, and say, why should we have, why must we live under occupation or, have kind of lack of representation in the lands in which we live? Because keeping the Jewish character of Israel is more important. If keeping the Jewish character of Israel was more important, then I would think more effort should be put into not ruling all these people and into withdrawing from their lands so that you don't force this question.
Look, Israel's a very powerful country. If Israel wanted to occupy Gaza tomorrow, it could. If Israel wanted to wipe out every Palestinian tomorrow, it could.
You don't get credit for not wiping out every Palestinian.
Hold on. Let me just make myself. I'm not. If Israel were as malign and as intent on ruling the Palestinians as its critics allege, it would have done so. Right? That's my point to those of you who are applauding. It doesn't because it doesn't want to rule the Palestinians. It didn't want to occupy the West Bank and Gaza to begin with. As a matter of fact, when Israel came into existence under a UN partition plan in 1947, it was Israel that accepted the partition plan, and it was the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors who rejected the partition plan. This is part of the reality that Israel has been dealing with, which is that all of its attempts to create an equitable settlement with the Palestinians and their neighbors, well, at least with the Palestinians, have been rejected. Okay, that's actually simply the historical record.
But Bret,
wait 1 second.
Okay.
It has been, one of them has been rejected after the other, and they were rejected in ways that were extraordinarily violent. I happened to witness that violence in person, up close, when I lived in Israel during the height of the Second Intifada in 2000 and between 2002 and 2004. Israel is not intent on an occupation. What Israel is intent on doing is making sure that it can survive as a Jewish state with a reasonable assurance that the people on the other side of the border, wherever that border is, will not immediately be committed to its destruction. The sad reality is that Hamas in Gaza does not want to defeat Israel. Hamas in Gaza wants to eliminate Israel. By the way, no other country exists under a similar threat, not just of defeat, but of total elimination. And that's something that people ought to consider. We often think about, we want Israel, Michelle and I surely agree we want Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state. Why has Jewish democracy kept electing people on the right in the last 15 or so years? Because unfortunately, they've seen that every time they have tried to make concessions to this generation of Palestinian leaders, they have not been met with olive branches, they have not been met with goodwill, they've been met with Hamas and rockets and so on. So that's just the reality that Israelis are living with. Israel does not wantonly want to rule over any Palestinians. And it's true, there are lots of right-wing Israelis who want the entirety of Israel. But what you just witnessed is an election in Israel where the party that does not want endless occupation of the Palestinians winning a plurality of the vote. And that's significant. That's a reality that people need to take into account. There is the suggestion implicit here that Israel wants to eliminate the Palestinians and eliminate Palestinian statehood. That's just not correct. And if it had wanted to do so, it would have done it.
You don't think that, wait, okay, but you don't think, I would say two things. First of all, you don't think that Netanyahu wants to eliminate Palestinian statehood? I mean, he's spoken extremely dismissively of the possibility of a two-state solution. And as you acknowledge, there's a lot of Israelis, obviously, that want separation, right? That don't want to continue this tragic and bloody and kind of horrifying entanglement. But there is a greater Israel lobby, and it includes a lot of the people who are setting up these facts on the ground, who are setting up, if Israel really didn't want all of these settlements that are kind of making a contiguous Palestinian state impossible, they wouldn't be building them. And I'm sure you've had the experience of, kind of driving around the West Bank, and you get to a roadblock, you're taking your taxi, you get to the roadblock, you get out, there's a taxi on the other side, you go somewhere else. It's this kind of long, drawn-out process that makes any sort of cohesive economy, any sort of kind of cohesive society extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. And again, my sense is that Israel either, at least in Israel, you can't speak of as, a unitary thing, but the people who are making these decisions either are actively hostile to kind of creating a basis for a Palestinian national homeland, or else they just don't care and are sort of happy to impose these facts. If Israel did not want to impose these facts on the ground, again, these settlements are not security outposts, right? You don't kind of protect your own security by putting families and children into these places where you're going to be a minority surrounded by a hostile and resentful population. And so this isn't about Israeli security, it's about land, it's about resources.
Look, does Donald Trump speak for you? Does he speak for you?
Of course not.
Right? Does he speak for me? No. Okay. He's the president. Right? He speaks for maybe 42% of the country. So when you listen to Netanyahu thinks this, well, Trump thinks that.
Right, but I would say this. Obviously,
Netanyahu is not the state of Israel.
Right, and obviously Donald Trump doesn't speak for me, but I nevertheless would say that, I think that you can say, the kind of obscene American policy in Syria, it might not be supported by most people. It might not kind of be representative of what American wants. It is nevertheless American policy right now, right?
But you don't say, okay,
is Israeli policy.
Donald Trump is president. He's doing X, Y, and Z, which is absolutely horrifying and disgusting. Therefore, we should call for the end of the United States because we don't. I mean, it's a.
I'm not talking about calling.
The fact that a country happens to be represented at any given moment in time by a politician who we may find disreputable, obscene, objectionable, whatever, okay, does not therefore lead to the conclusion that that country is itself illegitimate or has made a set of choices which have just rendered its existence questionable. And, we also have to have a conversation that's based in reality. You are talking about Israel-Palestine as if it's like California, Nevada or something. If California and Nevada became one country tomorrow, or one state
they could.
Tomorrow,
I don't think they would. I don't think they could live together happily. I think it would be a disaster. I mean, Americans can barely live together happily. But what I'm saying is that right, there's this Amos Oz line that I'm not going to get exactly right, but he said something like, people don't earn the right to self-determination through good behavior. And so again, this is the question I asked you before, and this is why I'm not arguing the anti-Zionist, this is kind of a meta argument, because I'm not so much arguing the anti-Zionist position as I'm arguing kind of for an understanding of the anti-Zionist position, or at least some segments of the anti-Zionist position. And so again, when I've said this to Palestinians, like, yes, you can't live together. It would be a terrible civil war. It would be, worse than Bosnia. And, what they will come back and say is that, you can't kind of continue to deny us our rights because you think that giving them would lead to something catastrophic. They will point to the fact that people had catastrophic beliefs about how South Africa would be after the end of apartheid. And again, I think they're wrong. I think it would be a disaster. But I also think that you cannot, I don't know what you say to the person who is saying, Greater Israel is now a reality. What is your argument for not giving us full rights in it, except for the fact that it would be too dangerous for the people who matter more here?
First of all, Greater Israel has rarely been less of a reality. In 1977, Greater Israel meant all of the Sinai, all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and I guess by 1980, or early 1980, it also meant part of Lebanon. Israel has been in the business of shrinking itself more dramatically than I think any other state in the modern world. So that's just it's not reality. If Israel wanted Greater Israel, okay, it would get it. If Israel were as intent on dominating the Palestinians, they would do it. They would simply adopt a Bashar
Wait,
Assad
are you really? But
type
you're not
of,
denying the kind of the growth of the settlement enterprise. I think, what was there, like 100,000 settlers in 1993, and now there's like 500,000 or something.
Yes,
right?
But they're on about 4% of the land. Okay, so it's not so simple as simply a population count. You can have lots of people. You and I are Manhattanites, or well, you're a Brooklynite. It's okay. You can have lots of people in a small amount of land. The real issue. Look, I wish I could concede that Israel's dispute with the Palestinians is a territorial dispute. If Israel really simply had a territorial dispute with the Palestinians, you'd say, well, just get out of the territory. If someone were to tell a majority of Israelis, if God, whatever, the future came and said, all you have to do is withdraw to the 67 lines, and you Israelis are guaranteed you're going to have as peaceful an existence as Costa Rica, okay, or whatever, Denmark. I suspect, in fact, I'm certain, that an overwhelming majority of Israelis would take that deal.
Right, but do you really? But the Palestinians, is it really fair to ask the Palestinians to forego their national aspirations until they can promise a Denmark-like existence for Israel?
The people who are currently denying Palestinian national aspirations is a theocratic government in Gaza and a kleptocratic government in Ramallah. That's who is, in actual fact, that is actually who's denying Palestinian national aspirations. If you had a Sadat rather than an Abbas in power in the Palestinian Authority, Israelis would jump at the opportunity to get out of this endless and wretched conflict with their neighbors. One thing I will not attribute to a majority of Israelis, and I don't think anyone should, is bad faith. They want to live as much in peace with their neighbors as anyone else. And that's one of the things that bothers me about the anti-Zionist position, because ultimately it says that the real obstacle to peace is that Israelis, for whatever reason, are just intent on seizing other people's land and denying them their rights. And that's not true. Anyone who has spent time in Israel understands that is not true. There are plenty of bad apples in Israel, just as there are bad apples in any other country. That's not true of Israelis as a whole. And that's one of the reasons why anti-Zionism so quickly transmutes into anti-Semitism, because it goes from an ideological position saying all of you Israelis are guilty of this crime. And that's one of the reasons we should be so suspicious of it. One very quick point, and I think Michelle is making a really useful distinction. There are plenty of honorable people who take an anti-Zionist position, right? There are plenty of thoughtful people who take other positions which are disreputable, which are wrong, and which are dangerous. But that does not mean that the position itself shouldn't be condemned. There are lots of great poets who were avid Stalinists, okay? Stalinism, that did not acquit Stalinism, all right? So there are lots of people, maybe in this audience, and what your goals are peace and justice and fairness. And I'm not charging you with bad faith. But what I'm saying is that when you take an anti-Zionist position, you are subscribing to an ideology which does not meet the tests of peace and justice and good faith.
I want to move to questions from the audience, and they're specifying for each of you. So this is for you, Michelle. Representative Omar, who stands in favor of BDS you support, has a habit of invoking millennial-old tropes when she speaks about American Jews in Israel. Parenthetically, Israel has hypnotized the world, follow the Benjamins, in other words, dollars. Dual loyalty, among others, closed caption. It's abundantly clear Omar is against Zionism. She's an active supporter and fundraiser for the CAR, which is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the US, just as Hamas is the arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. When she uses the tropes I just mentioned, is she being more than anti-Zionist? Is she also revealing deep-rooted anti-Semitic prejudice?
So I'm not sure about deep-rooted, but it's certainly she's revealing anti-Semitic prejudice, and I've written about that, right? There's no question that she had, and some of when she writes about this stuff, it sort of has not even in relation to Israel. So I've written about the fact that these are anti-Semitic tropes. I give her some credit for apologizing and promising to learn and kind of saying that she wasn't aware of these, of kind of the origins and the, millennial old stories and prejudices that she's drawing on when she says these things. So I give her some credit for apologizing, and then I give her less credit for doing it again. And so, right. But I do think that there is, to me, one of the problems about the way that this gets extrapolated is that, she has said these things that I think, like I said, are really, really troubling. They infuriate me as a Jew. They infuriate me as somebody who was really excited about Omar's election and feels like they undermine a political project that I am deeply attached to. They also are often then kind of attributed to other people in her orbit, right? So the discussion, when people accuse not just Omar of being anti-Semitic, they accuse Rashida Tlaib of being anti-Semitic by association. They accuse Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of being anti-Semitic by association. I would also say that, like I said, I've written columns condemning what Ilhan Omar said. I don't feel threatened by Ilhan Omar. What I feel personally threatened by in this country, I feel like, I never really had to think very much about anti-Semitism personally for most of my life. I don't know if that's true. I mean, you grew up in a very different context. It was really when Trump was elected. I mean, it were really during the Trump campaign when I first started getting bombarded with anti-Semitic death threats, often saying, go back to Israel, which, the irony is that some of the worst anti-Semites actually are Zionists themselves because they want us to go somewhere. And so now it is, at this moment that I feel like, this existential threat from multi-ethnic, multiracial liberal democracy, which is something that I thought we had been able to somewhat take for granted in this country until this very moment, is now in danger. And Ilhan Omar is on my side in preserving that. And, and so I feel much less threatened by her than by white nationalists on the right because at the end of the day, I don't think that she would undermine the rights of Jewish people in this country. But that's no excuse for any of the things that she said.
How do you view Representative Omar?
Look, I mean, number one, she's an elected representative, and when Donald Trump insisted that she, what was the line? Go back to
her country.
Go back to her country. I thought it was a revolting comment. But I have to say that I find her every bit as disturbing as I find someone like Stephen King of Iowa. And if I'm not going to make excuses for Steve King because he's some idiot who, I mean, he's worse than an idiot. He's a pernicious, prejudiced idiot. Why should I make excuses for Ilhan Omar? She strikes me as a highly intelligent woman who was told. I took her first apology on good faith. It was harder after the second and the third time. Look, I grew up in Mexico City, where I was exposed to kind of low-grade traditional religious anti-Semitism. In subsequent parts of my life, I've been exposed to murderous Islamist anti-Semitism, and then to right-wing, far right-wing anti-Semitism. I get it from all directions, and I have all of the mail and the threats to prove it. So I have hate mail from Trumpy anti-Semites, and I have hate mail from anti-Zionist anti-Semites who want to castrate me if I come into the state of New Mexico. I keep all of this mail as kind of.
But can I ask you? And this is a genuine question. Like, who do you really feel in danger by the asshole in New Mexico in the way in the way that I think we're endangered by the people who have actually shot up synagogues and sent bombs to journalists and the like?
Yes, I do. I feel equally in danger. I mean, let's not forget that it was anti-Israel, anti-Semites who laid siege to a synagogue in Paris in 2014. It was an anti-Israel, anti-Semite who murdered 4 Jews in a kosher supermarket in Paris. And all I would say is, I think it's irresponsible intellectually, and more personally, it's irresponsible as a Jew to pretend that the danger to the left is less than the danger to the right. There's a wonderful scene in a book called Not I, written by a now deceased German historian named Joachim Fest, who grew up in an anti-Nazi household in the 1930s in Berlin. And it's his memoir, really a tribute to his father. And his father was an intellectual who had many Jewish friends and kept saying the moment the Nazis came to power, you got to get out of here, you got to get out of here. Too few of them did. And there's a wonderful passage in the book where the son is relating a conversation by his father where he says, the tragedy of the Jews in Germany is that having grown up, it's hard to swallow this now, but having grown up in, quote, tolerant, educated Prussia, right, they had lost their instinct for danger, which had preserved them through the ages. That's almost an exact quote. And I feel incumbent on me as a writer and as a Jew that we cannot lose our instinct for danger. So when I hear Trump going on about the globalists, I'm going to denounce it. And when I hear Ilhan Omar saying it's all about the Benjamins, I'm going to denounce it. And I'm not going to choose between these two which of them threatens me more.
But I don't see why it's intellectually irresponsible to make I don't see why it's intellectually irresponsible to make distinctions, right? There are kind of greater and lesser dangers, and to say that sort of fashionable left-wing anti-imperialist anti-Semitism in this country, which in this country has no record of violence I'm trying to think. I mean, I'm sure that there is back in the days of the New Left, but not kind of in our adult lifetimes. To say that poses less of a danger when there are actually not any people from that. I don't want to say tradition, but those people are just not killing anyone. They're
But
not
Michelle,
doing,
if tomorrow, you don't want to make that argument, if I may say, because tomorrow, for all we know, a disturbed young man, almost certainly a young man, pumped up on anti-Zionist rhetoric that Israel is the greatest malefactor in the world, can walk into a synagogue and he'll kill 12 people. And then we'll say, well, now the scales are balanced.
No, the reason.
I watched
So here's
one terrorist attack after another in Israel. In fact, I saw them really up close in a way that has disturbed me ever since. And those were all anti-Zionist attacks.
Well, you're talking about Islamist attacks, which is very different than kind of attacks from the anti-Zionist secular left. Right?
No, I mean, I don't think that Jews are going to be beset by beret-wearing anti-Zionists. I mean, sorry,
right? That's my point. They're not as dangerous.
That's a cliche, but yes, but they will. And by the way, I don't think that the average Trumpian guy going on about globalism is dangerous. But what disturbs me is they will inspire someone who has less restraint and more anger and and greater psychological issues, and you will have some mass casualty attack. For the look, if Stalin had lived another 2 years, there would have been a Holocaust in the Soviet Union because of the doctor's plot. I don't think this is seriously disputed. All I'm saying is that the idea that we have to say, no, the left is not as malignant as the right, at least for now, is a bad way of approaching the problem. The central problem is the effort to take Jews collectively or their religious identity or their nationalist identity and single them out as uniquely malevolent people. And when you do that, you are setting the stage for some future tragedy and outrage. And I just think it's very dangerous to say, well, these people are committing microaggressions, but these other guys are really bad.
But there's a difference between a microaggression and a gun.
Yeah, until the microaggression becomes the guy walking into the kosher supermarket and shooting 4 people because he's mad about what Israel's doing, which is in fact what happened.
Again, you're talking about Islamist terrorism in France, right?
Islamist terrorism is anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic terrorism.
Right, but it's not secular. It's not kind of part of the secular left milieu, which I'm talking about. And I feel like we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but what I would say is that to me, the danger, what's going on in the United States, it's not the danger that in the United States right now is not that Jews per se are being singled out, because in a lot of cases we're not even we're usually the leading indicator of fascism or totalitarianism or authoritarianism, but we're not really here, right? It's not just Jews, there's a lot of different minorities that are being singled out and demonized. And it's not just that, Trump or various politicians are engaging in irresponsible rhetoric, right? You have all these kind of hive-like online communities, we're almost gamifying violence and kind of daring each other to do even more spectacular mass casualty events. And so as I see it, the people who are potential targets of those mass casualty events have something in common, and have even if we don't agree on a lot of things, we're on the same side. We are in a kind of common struggle for preserving the multiracial, multi-ethnic, liberal, democratic character of this country. And I think a lot of the people, or some section of the people that you think are kind of uniquely malignant because of their positions on Israel, I think are the allies of people like me in what I see as a much more existential fight.
Look, lots of people have been killed out of hatred, but out of idealism. Right? And so this is a reality that there were half the members of my family were fellow travelers of Joe Stalin at some point, and they weren't doing it because they thought Joe Stalin was an evil guy who was going to kill lots of people. They thought he represented the future of humanity.
But do you think and you think that's a danger on the modern left?
Yeah, no, I think. But my point is, look, I fear the parts of the right that you're describing because they're disreputable. But in some ways, I fear anti-Zionists because they're semi-reputable, right? Which means they have perhaps potentially greater access to power and influence at some point in the future. And that scares me when a country like Israel, as I mentioned earlier, alone among countries, is vulnerable not just to defeat, but to destruction. And I just don't think that there's anything to be gained by having a kind of angels dancing on a head of a pin sort of argument about which form of hatred should concern us more. Why can't it be both? Why can't we simply say we detest the fascistic right that is trafficking in old-fashioned anti-Semitic tropes from, say, a century ago, but we also detest this newfangled form of hatred which is demonizing an entire country in ways that scarily resemble the ancient demonization of the Jews. And neither of them is okay. Now, that doesn't mean we should ban them. This is a free country. And it doesn't mean that we should treat people who subscribe, at least to an anti-Zionist view, as de facto horrible people. They might be misguided people. One of the things I'm trying to do tonight, is to say to those of you who might consider yourselves anti-Zionists, as Cromwell once said, pray, sir, in the bowels of Christ, that you might be mistaken, right? That maybe you're mistaken and that the view you are holding is not a view that you want to hold. It's not really a view that is genuinely compatible with a better world.
I want to pitch a softball to Bret. Do you believe that today's campus environment, including professors and administrators, are agnostic on the issue of the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? What do you think?
My question should go to you.
No, I'm the moderator.
Howard? I mean, I don't know. I'm not an academic.
What's your opinion?
Look, the problem with all of that kind of question is, and I think Michelle would agree, there's always the danger of mistaking anecdote for data, right? I mean, I think most academics don't think for 5 seconds about Israel-Palestine. They're thinking about, getting tenure and compensation and what does Howard think of them, or, And so what we often find is this little petri dish, kind of Middle Eastern studies, and the BDSers on campus and Jewish students on campus who are sort of at it, while everyone else is just like, get me out of here, beam me up, Scotty. But I will say this: we live in an era of rightful sensitivity to all kinds of prejudice, right? And I think it's wonderful that we're far more sensitive, never mind to sexual assault and harassment, but mansplaining, for example, and ways in which men, typically Bigfoot conversations and all the rest, we're rightfully sensitive to racial discrimination and quote hidden signals, which to the receiver, if you're African American, aren't so hidden, right? But I do think that there is this weird exception for many Jewish students where entire conversations are considered okay that aren't so okay, right? I mean, if you had a French student on campus, I'm just picking on the French, right? If you had a French student on campus, it would be weird if there were a whole sort of movement about why, never mind France, Morocco, okay? Why Moroccan students shouldn't be there. The occupation of Western Sahara is an ongoing disgrace. We should not invite the Moroccan student to our club. If he's a visiting faculty member from Morocco, he might not participate in our activities until Morocco gets out of the Western Sahara. You'd automatically say to yourself, that's not right. I mean, this poor Moroccan guy has nothing to do with the policy, right? And who knows what the policy is and how that came about. And yet, all the time, I think Israeli scholars are dealing with questions about their academic fitness when they visit foreign universities. whether they're going to get papers accepted, and so forth and so on. And so in that sense, my suspicion, and again, it's based on anecdote, not data, is yes, there is something different there.
You'd like to comment on that, Michelle?
Well, again, I guess to me it's kind of eliding the difference between Israelis and Jewish students. Going back to what Bret said before about, why isn't there a boycott of India over the occupation, or, basically occupation is probably the wrong word because of Kashmir's status, but because of what they're doing to Kashmir, both kind of putting it on lockdown and then making this plan for, sort of ethnic dilution by bringing in a bunch of Hindus. If Kashmiris called for a boycott, called for global solidarity with what they're experiencing, I think people should heed that, and I think they should heed it even if some Indian students on campus found that offensive. And so, I think that there is obviously anti-Semitism on campus. There's obviously incredibly, not just bigoted, but just incredibly obnoxious forms of anti-Zionism, and it's somewhat licensed by the fact that, as Bret said earlier, Israel is a very powerful country, and so it's hard to treat it as the underdog. And college students in particular, I think, to their credit, tend to be defenders of the underdog. But I also, in my experience, and again, this is just anecdotal. It's not based on data. You can't draw a neat line, I think, on a lot of these campuses between anti-Zionist activists and Jewish students, because in many cases it is the Jewish students, the left-wing Jewish students, who are most. They think about Israel the most. They're most heartbroken by when they kind of discover that actually existing Israel doesn't live up to what they learned about in their liberal Zionist synagogue. And they're often, very active in Students for Justice in Palestine. And so again and again, we have these kind of flare-ups. There was just one at Bard College where, someone will say that a Jewish speaker was interrupted by protesters, and this shows, what a kind of crisis that we have with anti-Semitism on campus. And then a few days later, you realize that the protesters were all Jewish, right? Which I think gives it a slightly different character.
Can I just ask, Michelle, this is totally sincere question. In your view, India has been occupying Kashmir for 70 odd years. And
occupying is the wrong word for what they had with this kind of special status agreement.
You can read Salman Rushdie. This goes back. Pakistanis certainly think India's been occupying Kashmir for a long time. Why isn't there any movement, as far as I'm aware, of Students for Justice in Kashmir?
Well, first of all, the current crisis in Kashmir is like a month old? I understand what you're saying, that there's this long-standing...
It's been going on for generations.
No, what's going on now has not been going on for generations. For generations, Kashmir has had a special status relationship with the Indian government that the Indian government just took away, just sent troops in, just cut everybody's communications. What's going on, just said that they have a plan to bring in a lot of Hindu settlers to change the ethnic composition of Kashmir. That's new, right? That's new. And and one of the reasons when you say, why isn't there a boycott movement, which I guess is the corollary of that, when I ask this to Palestinian activists, why aren't we boycotting Saudi Arabia? Why aren't we boycotting? There's a host of countries that are doing terrible things, that are doing worse things to their people than the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. And often they'll say, well, where is the call to boycott, right? If there was a civil society call of, kind of Kashmiri activists calling people to boycott, then people should take it seriously and heed it. It's not kind of you personally just deciding that you're going to, kind of not shop at certain stores. These are movements that are typically organized and called for by the people in those countries if they think that it's a useful tactic.
India has been following an abusive policy in Kashmir long before the last month. isn't it suspicious? Isn't it strange that, and I choose India because India is a democracy, it's an ally, we help it in many ways, just as we do Israel, maybe not to the same extent. Nobody, I can guarantee you, I will make two solid predictions for the future. The sun will continue to set in the West, okay? And there will never be a movement of Students for Justice in Kashmir as a mass movement on University of California campuses.
There was
that's a predict. I'm sure there will be one or two people, but it ain't going to happen.
But
and
again,
I think it behooves us to ask why.
Well, let me ask. I mean, as you know, there was a huge movement of Students for Tibet, right? There was a huge movement of kind of Tibetan solidarity. And again, part of the reason is because it was what Tibetans were calling for, right? So these things, it's not really up to students at UC Irvine to say this terrible thing is happening and I'm going to start a movement, a boycott movement in solidarity with the people who live there, unless there's a sort of movement in that place that's asking for people to engage in that tactic as a way of helping them. Right? I mean, so, and I guess these things always come up. It's true that people's attention is attenuated, right? And there's kind of often kind of truly horrible, despicable human rights abuses fall through the cracks. But the way that these are always invoked as a reason, well, why aren't you boycotting that? Or why aren't you boycotting that? As if it's an excuse for supporting policies that some of us find abhorrent in Israel. There are also reasons beyond mere anti-Semitism why American students would be particularly concerned with Israel. Part of it is that our country has an enormous role in supporting Israel, and so people feel, I think, rightly complicit. And again, as I said, a lot of it is because these are Jewish students. These are Jewish students who feel personally, they're either Jewish students or Palestinian students who have, a personal stake and investment in what's going on there.
And you don't think that it has anything to do with the fact that the alleged oppressor in this occupation or in this situation is the Jewish state?
Well, here's what I think. I think that I talk to people all the time. I've had this experience myself to a less stark degree, of kind of growing up with like a basic liberal Zionist outlook. I remember, I've said this before on the podcast, I have this memory of my mother telling me about how Vanessa Redgrave was an anti-Semite because of some speech she'd given about the Palestinians. And I never really took most of what my parents said for granted, but for some reason I took that for granted. And, and it was truly shocking for me the first time I visited the West Bank. And another time when I visited the West Bank, I remember going to Hebron, and Hebron is basically, it's like a sort of, it's a Potemkin village of the horrors of the occupation, except that it was erected by Israel, not by the Palestinians. And you sort of have this experience of like, oh, if somebody had explained to me what I'm seeing right now, I probably wouldn't have even believed them. I don't think that, and so I don't even know if I can explain it to people who used to believe what I believed in a way that would make it legible. I'm just a crank now. And I've talked to a number of young Jews who have had that sort of experience. And, this kind of searing experience of seeing the occupation up close, and maybe they would have a similarly searing experience if they went to Kashmir, but they haven't gone to Kashmir. And you just can't attribute that to anti-Semitism.
We're at a point now where we're winding down, and as per our understanding with the two speakers, they're going to give a 2 to 3 minute summation, summative comments, and I want to first ask Bret to reflect on the opening question about the issues at stake, and what do you hope for in the future?
Well, I guess the first point I want to reiterate just how grateful I am that you've hosted this event and that you've listened so attentively, I hope attentively, and also my gratitude to Michelle for being such a wonderful conversation partner and to you. Look, let me end on a personal note. My mother was born as a Jewish child in Nazi-occupied Europe in 1940. During the last 2 years of the war. She was born in Milano, in Italy. The Gestapo basically ran Milano, and had they found her, fortunately they didn't, thanks to the benevolence of an Italian family, she would have been wiped out. So the question of Jewish existence is not some sort of abstract concept in my life. It's not something that happened to distant cousins in Europe that our family had left long behind. I'm the son of a displaced person who escaped the Nazis. And my mother was profoundly fortunate that in 1950, President Truman enacted legislation that allowed hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, most of them Jews, to come to this country. And my sense of affinity for this country, my patriotism, and I might add, my disgust with this administration is deeply tied in to those facts about my life. Now, we're living in a moment when I can't imagine a President Trump extending the same sort of hand to my mother's equivalent in this generation, had she been from Latin America or Iran or any number of other countries. And that disturbs me. It disturbs me as an American, but it also disturbs me as a Jew. It meant our family managed to get in, but that is conditional. There's one state in the world which, had it existed when my mother was a child, would have provided her with a refuge. And that's the state of Israel. Jews have been persecuted for thousands of years, and for 2,000 years, there was no state that would offer them a refuge and safety and the kind of security that Israel provides. Leaving aside all of the debates about Israel, that ought to be sacred. That is argument enough for why Zionism and the state of Israel are things that ought to be cherished and defended, most of all by American Jews whose future in this country may not be quite as safe as we may like to think. And so what I'm asking you to consider is, even as we have robust and free and open debates about the path that Israel should choose, the nature of Israel's relationship with the United States, and vice versa, the idea that we would ever accept as a legitimate and reputable point of view the notion that that state, that sanctuary should cease to exist, that ought to concern us. And I would just put my final remark to those of you in this room who don't agree with me. Consider just that there are now 9 or so million Israelis, 7 million Jews who are living in relative safety they don't have elsewhere in the Western world, because that state exists. That should be your baseline. After that, by all means, be aggressive in your arguments for what you think Israel should or should not do. But don't deny the Jewish people the right to a sanctuary whose absence meant so much tragedy for their forebears. That's it.
Thank you, Bret. Michelle?
So I would say two things. I mean, responding to what Bret just said, probably 95% of which I agree with, particularly the kind of fact that I think as a Jew, your position feels precarious, even in a country where Jews have thrived as they had, in few other places in the world. You could have said the same thing about the Jews of Germany in the 1920s. Although I think that the relationship between at least some Jews in the diaspora and Israel has changed by Israel's actions in the last decade and particularly the last couple of years. I would say that, and this isn't even totally germane to what we're talking about, but I would say that for a long time, my kind of alienation from the kind of reflexive liberal Zionism that I was raised with was based on Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Now it is based on Israel's, what I see as betrayal of Jews in the diaspora. Israel, if nothing else, Jews outside of Israel who are asked to support Israel, to defend it, should be able to count on Israel to oppose anti-Semitism. But Israel has, it's obviously the most of any country in the world. There's no more enthusiastic partner for Donald Trump. There's no more enthusiastic partner for a lot of these even more terrifying right-wing, anti-Semitic, nationalist regimes in Europe. And so if Israel, under Netanyahu, and I take Bret's point before that Netanyahu does not represent Israel, but if Israel is going to go in a direction where it becomes part of this axis of authoritarians, where Jews are not welcome in all of these countries, but at least they can go there, then Israel's not, a refuge. It's, I don't know, it's a, I don't know what the word is for it, but it's certainly not the kind of savior for Jews like me who do feel uneasy about our place out here. The last thing I would say is that one thing we didn't get to talk about is that Bret talked about all these horrors that have been perpetrated by violent Palestinian organizations, by the PLO, by Hamas, by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. You could go on and on and on. For as long as I've been writing about this, people have said, when is the nonviolent Palestinian movement going to come? And now it has. Now it's BDS, right? And so, boy, you might, whatever you can say about boycott, divestment, sanctions, it is a mass nonviolent movement, which is what people who've been, rightly horrified by Palestinian terrorism, that's the sort of strategy they've long hoped that the Palestinians would adopt. And so if we say that that is also an illegitimate strategy, then I'm not sure what it is that we think should be allowed for a people whose, kind of national aspirations I do think are as legitimate as our own.
Before we end the program, I first and foremost want to thank you all for making UCI a part of your evening, and I hope this conversation with Michelle Goldberg and Bret Stephens has provided food for thought. Before we exit, I also want to acknowledge the many individuals from the Office of the Chancellor, the Office of Inclusive Excellence, the UCI Police Department, Student Affairs for their important work in bringing this event to pass. And finally, I just hope you return to UCI for our future programs. Thank you and good night.